Rick and Morty comic issue 30. I'm not sure I like the art here. Something about it is a bit off. Art speaks for itself, so. Jerry asked Beth if she could pick up some of that good salsa on her way home, and she asked why he can't do it because she has a 10-hour shift today. Usually, these two interacting together when alone is just a mundane waste of time, but it can be funny and relatable if the dialogue's good enough. Jerry says he can't go out because he doesn't have any clean clothes, and shows off some stains on his shirt. Then Beth asks him why he doesn't do the laundry then. So her excuse for not doing the household chores is that she's too busy working all day. And she naturally expects him to pull his weight by doing it for her. He says that they don't have any detergent. She cathartically lampshades him waiting until now to tell her this. And he complains that he's not the one who forgot to buy the detergent. She complains that she has to do everything around here while facepalming. Then Rick asks her to get a new fire extinguisher since she's going to the store. So, where's the sci-fi? So far, this is a story that could be about any sitcom. But at least it's trying to develop on Beth as a character, making her sympathetic and relatable. And it's not like she's a total idiot for not getting a divorce already and solving her problem with Jerry, because we saw how sad she was about it in the show when it did happen. So this is a person who will never be happy. And I read that these people were based on the parents of either the creator of the show or one of the staff on the show. People who stay together when they're in an unhappy marriage. She gets a detailed, complicated coffee, and for no reason, the person working at a coffee shop, so not exactly above her, insists on not calling her a doctor because she's a vet. Beth is just insisting on being called doctor because of her ego. And I guess because she's embarrassed to be a missus when she's got a husband like that. But all it does is waste time. I have a hard time believing that some random minimum wage worker, or some random anybody, would just casually disrespect her like that. She's still a surgeon, which would still require a lot of skill and save lives, so that's something that logically anybody would respect. I have no idea how this woman knows she's a vet. How is her job any of her business? It's also forced to me because in my experience, nearly everyone I see or interact with in person, normal people tend to be polite, by default. Maybe it is just a stereotype that Canadians are more polite than Americans, but in my experience, that's just the way society is here. Being polite to people's faces is just basic good social skills. So it's hard to believe a random stranger would choose to be impolite to her. But it's also hard to believe a mere coffee shop worker would choose to disrespect the job of a vet. That was probably intentional hypocrisy, but it's still too confusing. Then after we see someone say that she can tell just by Beth's face what she had to deal with, and it happened again, we see someone at Beth's job doubtful that a pregnant horse with a weak heart will make it. And Beth is determined to make sure she does make it, presumably because her entire ego is riding on it. And then she gets interrupted by someone who tells her that she's needed in ER because of a heart problem by another horse. And then she loses the horse and goes into denial about it and cries. But wouldn't she be used to this? That'd be a regular part of her job. It seems unprofessional of her. I guess the idea is that she's reacting like this because of the buildup of all the stress of her daily life that she barely complains about. She said earlier that looking angry is all she could do to keep from killing everyone. Still, I feel like a lot of this is just boring and wasting my time. I already know she's a horse surgeon. She walks out of the room, hugs the disappointed person who was worried about a horse, and goes to drink some wine. Then the owner wants to gather everyone in the lobby, and he says, "As you all know," and blathers on and on about stuff we don't need to read. Then he says it's time to retire, and he passes the hospital down to his son, who's smirking at a time like this, making it really obvious that he never should have trusted him and he's just an idiot. So the plot after this is really predictable. Of course he decides to close the hospital. And somehow, even though his father tells him no, he can't stop him and immediately revoke his job. Beth desperately begs him to reconsider, and he fortunately is given a logical excuse. He never saw his dad because of this place. 70-hour work weeks, and he was on call every night. He unintentionally reveals that Beth has a lot in common with his father because of this. She might be just as neglectful to her kids, and she's failing to learn from this experience. She's somehow failing to learn that her kids could grow up to be just as resentful as him. He reveals that he doesn't even like how horses look, but at least is justified by bias. His father tells Beth that he already signed it over to him and didn't know that was what he would do. Yeah, apparently after all that time of knowing his son, this comes as a surprise to him. He never expected that he'd be resentful of his neglect. There's no comedy and charm in the story, nor is there any sci-fi. So this isn't the franchise playing to its strengths. It was immediately obvious that an episodic series like this wouldn't make Beth actually lose her job and have to get a job at another horse surgeon clinic, because that'd require her to move, if there's not a clinic close enough to her. And that'd require the artist to learn how to draw a new house. So even though Beth's assistant tells her to relocate her family to Kentucky, it's clearly pointless because this series isn't about to change the status quo. There's no tension here. Her assistant is actually trying to convince her to not go back to her husband and family, and says that she could deserve to be happy instead. Yeah, but she has responsibilities to her family. She's tempted, so she doesn't say no right away. She's told by her secretary that the mayor has gone into labor, and she unprofessionally tells her that she's going to need her help even though she's just a secretary. I think that would go wrong and get them both fired. Even her suggesting this should get her fired. So the story isn't really worth it if it just makes me wonder why she keeps her job. I mean, this is kind of a predictable plot to have with her job anyways. Then the new boss shows up and tells them to stop what they're doing, being over-the-top cartoonishly evil for a boss. And then out of nowhere, it turns out that the owner of the horse that died wants to shoot them all, saying that they took everything from him because of one horse dying. Can he buy a new one? This may be Rick and Morty, but it's still too outlandish. Beth then spends a long time on a boring, generic speech to make an armed gunman feel better about the loss of his horse, when if he was willing to threaten a bunch of people who tried their best to save her because of one horse dying, then you'd think it'd be hopeless. But him looking sad and not angry earlier did foreshadow that he wasn't pure evil. But still. Beth then has a cheesy moment by saying that the birth of a baby horse is an actual miracle in the world, and expects that to cheer everyone up. How is something that happens all the time in nature a miracle? Then she actually relates to the bad guy Mr. Habsburg about how she knows what it's like to have an absent father, and then she says that she chose to be the type of person who kept things alive, not shut them down. And yet she still kinda chose to be an absent parent anyways. She's expecting that to make him change for the better? Saying that she's better than him? Why doesn't he call her out on being an absent parent herself? She says that a horse's heart is 10 times as big as a human's, and so it has 10 times more love to give, even though love comes from the brain. How does she know a horse has 10 times more love? She's just saying that. Because how can you quantify that? Because Deus Ex Machina, Habsburg randomly gets over his lifelong justified hatred of horses because he saw one baby horse that was just born and therefore probably wouldn't look very presentable in real life. So he decides to keep St. Equina's open. If it was gonna be that easy, don't even bother writing the plot to be as slow paced as it is. This could have been the only scene with him in it. Then because Beth's secretary called the police on her phone silently earlier, the cops burst in. Then the cops shoot him anyways instead of him dropping his weapon right away like a real person would. So he falls down and shoots Habsburg to death in a needlessly grisly fashion. Like, it's not like the farmer looks like someone that the cops would have a bias against, so why were they so trigger happy? It'd actually be better writing if he didn't have a confusing heel-face turn then, because then it'd at least try to come off as climactic. Beth has a 1,000-yard stare as she goes home like a normal person, and then she comes home and sees Morty and Rick being grabbed by a giant squid alien while they and Jerry don't have any clothes on. Fortunately, they censor that. But why that and not Habsburg's death? Rick tells Morty that if he bites the tentacle, maybe it'll release one of them, instead of squeezing them all harder and trying to kill him quicker. I guess it makes sense because he'd be startled from the pain and so he'd loosen his grip. Maybe the monsters are an escaped experiment of Rick's, or came in through his portal? Why were they all not in their clothes? We'll never know. That just mocks us because we could have seen how that went instead of a dramatic, boring, and predictable plot. After everything Beth saw today, she doesn't care about this. Rick then gets sent out of the room and says that detergent and a fire extinguisher are just what he needs to get rid of the monster. Well, using the Chekhov's gun is good. It's a shame this doesn't make Beth feel better, The fact that the stuff she brought home saved her family's life. And Rick and Morty briefly laugh and act cheerful, since they're used to always triumphing in their adventures no matter how wacky they get. The story ends with Beth running a bath and pouring some wine, being told by Jerry that she forgot the salsa, which she could have avoided if she had written a note and kept it with her. And she briefly goes under the water because she's so depressed. But of course she'll be fine because she's the main character. So that was just a needlessly depressing final panel that wasted our time. Like, this doesn't really have a point because I'm sure the vast majority of her stories off screen aren't this depressing. This story was a boring, predictable, dramatic story that plays to none of the strengths of the series. It shows off why Beth isn't the main character. I don't want to see gore, so I don't want to see the details of her job. I'm glad that they gave a proper fruiting excuse to Mr. Habsburg, which explained why he had the over-the-top seeming plan of shutting down the horse clinic. It's such an obvious villain to give her story, though. Like, to give it stakes that it wouldn't normally have. It was obvious that she wouldn't have to relocate her family and get a job somewhere else, because that changed the status quo in even a minor way for an episodic series. So the tension was always artificial. It's a comic book, you know, you're allowed to give them a different place to live. Archie's Sonic is a kid's comic, and it moved the characters from Knothole to Mobotropolis and back. I was surprised that Habsburg ended up killed, but it was always predictable that he'd end up changing his mind because Beth was always trying to lecture him. And her exact argument was really weak. He should have already heard the argument that horse surgeons are saving lives and are better than him, considering how long he's been alive. The ending just made me wish I saw how Rick got to that situation, because that'd have everything that actually made the series good. But it does do a good job making Beth sympathetic. Usually she's portrayed as unlikable because all she does is be an unhappy wife to Jerry, and she's too clingy to even enjoy being apart from him. And the kind of couple she's in is extremely overdone in animation. And I already assumed that her alcoholism was justified by her stressful life. It doesn't make me do it. I understand that Beth is one of the main characters, and so it'd be weird if she never got a story focusing on her life. But it just became the biggest argument against doing that. But it'll never happen again, so I'm glad I got it out of the way.